This episode is brought to you by Audi. The road is calling. Embrace the thrill of the drive with the all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron. Featuring effortless power, serious acceleration, and advanced Audi tech. It's not just a new EV. It's a new way to experience driving. The all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron is here. The next chapter of Audi starts now.
You are tuned in to the FowlWeather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
All you ever wanted to know about King Greenhead in this 4-part series about the history of the North American mallard. In part 3, we hit the highlights about changes to the mallard population through time and our historical and current approach to harvest management. Why did we have restrictive seasons before, but not today? What changed? We also talk spring turkeys, gobble gobble, the breakup of the Polar Vortex, and why nasty narratives must die, all this week on the FowlWeather Podcast. Remember that this last season you knew where the ducks were at before the ducks knew where they were at. We are very thankful for our every week listeners. You know who you are. Those that never miss a single migration forecast episode each Monday morning throughout the season. Y'all are as ate up as me about ducks, duck biology, and duck migration. Our dedicated weekly listeners can pick the best days to hunt because the FowlWeather Podcast forecasts fresh ducks hot from the north. You know where the ducks are at before the ducks know where they're at. Shoot those ducks from the north before they know where they're at. If y'all could just also take a minute to rate us on Spotify and Apple Podcast or wherever you listen, we'd appreciate it very, very much. I'm your host, Dr. Mike, coming to you from the home office in Jack's Reef. Man, we went from 0 to 105 hot seconds, and it was hot this week at the farm. Most of the snow melted. We started our tomatoes, peppers, okra, and other goodies next to the wood stove with lights on them to keep them from getting too leggy. We've been pruning the heritage fruit trees and grapes while we think about trouts and turkeys to come. Some of you are on the verge of turkey season in the South, or maybe even just started at this time of the year, but we still have hundreds of thousands of snow geese kind of streaming over the farm. All the fall, winter seasons, kind of hunting seasons are over for us, and the springtime seasons have not really yet started. But it does give us time to reflect, reset, and focus on the tasks to come. We are working with our seed guys to get food plot orders done, planting the fields and other folks' food plots that we help out, and starting to make trees into firewood for next year. Hey, like everywhere across duck country USA, it never ends in Jack's Reef country. And from our travels, we've recognized, right, just what I said, the same from y'all, it never ends. One season blends into the next, just like that of the old greenhead that we talked about in episode 2, where we went through the whole annual cycle of a hen mallard and her greenhead partner. But here at the farm, we are really waiting on our first gobble of the year. You know, like many states, New York has actually seen a decline in turkey abundance, or at least that is what's perceived by hunters. Years ago, I tell people I would leave turkeys to go shoot other turkeys, and they're like, what do you mean by that? I'd leave an uncooperative turkey that was hung up at like 100 yards to kind of chase down a hot tom that I got on and died in, 15 minutes or less once set up. Now, around here, around the farm and nearby, if you raise a gobble in an entire morning, you stick with it because it might be the only gobble you hear all day. Now, this isn't everywhere in the state. And just like a lot of places, there's certainly pockets of turkeys, but many, many, many folks have noted how much harder it is nowadays to find turkeys. In my other job, my real job at ESF, we've initiated turkey research, and there's so much more to come on that front. But we, as I said, are waiting on the first gobble of the year and kind of waiting on other things like killdeer to show up and woodcock to talk and the Phoebes to show up at the barn. So it's that time of year where things are getting warm, but, still no gobble when we walk those dogs first thing in the morning at the farm. Today, mostly what you're going to hear about are drivers of mallard populations and how the waterfowl community makes harvest management decisions. If you listened in last week that covered the annual cycle of the mallard, well, it was a bit dry, or maybe even boring, but we also must understand that if we want good information, it's not always going to be fantastical, and that the truth, the facts, are sometimes dry. We also dig a bit right here soon into kind of the bad narratives floating around about duck populations. The Polar Vortex breakup is also happening right now. It is happening in mid-March instead of mid-April this year. You know, mid-April is kind of that typical time for the Polar Vortex to break up. So how does the polar vortex break up? At some point, the sun's influence just becomes too great in the Arctic, and the cold can't keep its spin at the poles. So it takes a summer vacation, but in that breakup, a quick cold mass runs its course, usually down into Canada in the eastern U.S. So if any of you have had a few cold nights recently, or have that coming this week, that was the breakup of the polar vortex for the year, really. Hot days to come, and growing chances of an El Nino next winter? But it's way, way too early to tell with confidence. We might be in an ENSO neutral type situation, which was kind of close to what we had this year. We kind of had a little La Nina. That's really going away. We're not sure where we're going to be headed next year, so stick with the FowlWeather podcast as we continue to follow that development. But let's just shoot right into comments about bad narratives. There is a lot of misinformation, we've talked about it here on the podcast, floating around about duck populations, duck conservation, and harvest management right now. We covered a bunch of this on the Burn It All Down Part 1 episode, which was episode 74. In that episode, we invited folks from other podcasts to reach out to us if they had any questions about how data streams work and how those data streams were incorporated into duck conservation and management. We do appreciate the podcasts that reach out to us to gather this information so that what they were producing was portrayed correctly. We also grabbed the attention of our friend again, Ramsey Russell of the Duck Season Somewhere podcast, and I'm doing an interview with him this coming week to dig a bit deeper into the subject of misinformation and why it is so harmful. But let me simply build out a little bit on that here today before we meet with him. First and foremost, before I get into this and maybe get a little snarky, and I had a good conversation with a client of mine the other day from Wisconsin, and we, chatted about kind of some of the podcast stuff, and I was like, man, I don't want to be condescending about this stuff, and he said, sometimes it's worthwhile to be snarky about stuff, but we try not to. So first and foremost, we're always going to give our fellow duck hunters the benefit of the doubt, assume that they are working from a passion for Duck Country USA and looking out for all of our best interest, all duck hunters across this great country and beyond. So do not take anything here as anything other than that comment in the end, because that is our goal at the FowlWeather Podcast, to inform and entertain. We certainly want to leave Duck Country USA better than we found it and arm all our great friends across Duck Country with the best information possible. It is why we embarked on the 4-part Mallard series, and also will be detailing how all the data streams that go into waterfowl conservation work throughout summer 2025 before launching back into our duck migration forecast for fall/winter 2025. So why is misinformation so dangerous? Ramsey and I, again, will dig deep into this later, so please do tune into Duck Season Somewhere as well. But we're going to put some brief pins in it here today. The playbook seems real here, folks. First, what you have to do is bring down the current status quo, even if it functions reasonably. That's been done by many even before our current situation. It was the idea that cornfields are what keep ducks north in winter. That information still floats around, and I think we've actually, done a good job of debunking it, but it seems like it's actually gained ground again. Anytime ducks don't show up, people have to find reasons for why they're not here. I think the flooded cornfield idea is a bit more muted than previously, but the real toxic information floating around is that our data streams used for waterfowl conservation and decision-making are not useful enough to even manage duck populations properly on this continent. And that has certainly gained ground in circles, because in the information age, anyone looking for a reason why they are not shooting ducks wants something to blame and something they feel like they can control, right? Nobody wants to feel helpless, so they search out that information. So let's back up, though, and realize that duck populations are low right now, and as low as they've been in the past, right? And that instills concern. Heck, that is what Ducks Unlimited and nearly all conservation or other organizations were built out of. Concern for the conservation of ducks. The big difference now is that we have enough understanding to know that duck populations fluctuate and we aren't in a doom and gloom situation. What we need to do is keep our eye on the prize, and that is habitat conservation. If wetlands don't exist and grasslands are plowed under, you don't have ducks to shoot. At the end of the day, it's all about habitat. So, what has been driven into our brains lately is seemingly threefold. One is that we don't count ducks correctly because the sex ratios have changed, and so we have paper ducks. That is, when we consider a small group of mallards as paired with hens, and they actually are not, we are creating paper ducks or counting ducks that don't exist. Number two, the prairies are in trouble because of drain tile, and even though some water is on the landscape during surveys, that it is not really available water to breeding ducks because it drains too quickly and is not a place for ducks to raise their young. And then number three, our harvest information program is not even close to reality. That is, those data that we collect are not reflective of hunters' numbers and those hunters' harvest. Under these 3 points, folks have discounted the waterfowl conservation and management world. Then, the next thing they do is rewrite their own narrative that duck populations are in trouble and we need to do something about it to quote-unquote save the ducks. And that something is changing seasons and bag limits. Again, of course, when duck populations decline and we don't see ducks during season, we all want to feel like we have some capacity to change that outcome. None of the passionate duck people across duck country want to feel helpless, so we all grasp for something we can change, and here we seem to find a bunch of folks eating up the new narrative, be it in the flooded corn to the north world, or paper ducks, or our data aren't useful arguments. People eat up that narrative because they want something to blame, and I can completely understand that. We completely understand that. We've even started to hear that ducks don't migrate based on weather, and they migrate to southern wintering areas no matter what. So maybe we should add a fourth bullet point here, right? Because the comment is that ducks migrate solely on time of year or photo period and do not adjust based on weather, which every ounce of information out there strongly contradicts. Of course weather affects duck migration. Is it 100% of the reason of where they're at and when they're at different locations? No. But it has an influence that plays out each year along with other complicated factors like food, hunting pressure, time of year, which is photo period, and individual duck experience in the past. Okay, so we don't want to take up all our time today on this because we truly believe the interview with Ramsey will be a great way to tell this story. But let's be clear. Duck populations fluctuate. And the last time we had a kerfuffle around duck populations was around 2005 to 2008 when duck populations, and specifically mallards, were low. The argument was that ducks don't migrate because of flooded corn to the north. Period. Not true. Now we're in a new age of low duck populations again, and so you are aware, it was radio silence about these types of topics of ducks are in trouble or anything having to do with any problems with data streams between kind of that 2005 low and our present low duck population. When you all are shooting ducks, when there were actually ducks around, few people look deep into duck science and duck conservation at that time other than the people that do it professionally like myself. But now we are into another era of questioning where are the ducks. The playbook of recent disruptions is obvious even to the most casual observer. They first burnt down the science, and then they rewrote the narrative to focus on harvest. The idea that we can't count ducks correctly or measure harvest or count May ponds has been spread widely now. But it just ain't that cut and dry, my friends. So next up, a gut check about the reality of the situation of ducks in North America. Look, folks, the Farmland Group across the Mid-South is your one-stop shop for real estate brokerage, consulting, management, lending, and appraisals. If you own land or you want land, the Farmland Group is where it's at. With over $500 million in farm sales and growing, Gwynn and Shelby Smith have you covered. Look, if you're thinking about buying or selling, contact the Farmland Group to access their full suite of services. If you already own property and want to build equity and value, the Farmland Group gets it done. If you're looking to purchase a new property, well, they get that done too, and they have access to some of the best lending available. Looking to sell? Get it appraised with the Farmland Group affiliated appraiser. But let's be clear for our listenership too. They also offer farm and hunt property management to create places that attract more ducks and more bucks. Who doesn't want that? More ducks and more bucks. Let the Farmland Group build value into your property. Find them today at farmlg.com. That's farmlg.com. You're not going to be disappointed. Contact Shelby Smith today at farmlg.com and let him know that the Foul Weather Podcast sent you their way. Okay, and we are back. Here's the gut check, the reality, right? Number one, let's just go with Arkansas mallard harvest. We'll talk a little Missouri and Mississippi stuff here in a second. We now have all seen the graphs from 1999 to present, the plummeting total mallard harvest, right? Reality is if you divide mallard harvest by hunter days afield, it basically tracks with the mallard breeding population with some oddities, likely resulting from annual variations in weather and, other stuff as we noted before. You can find this graph on the Foul Weather Podcast Facebook page, but we also recently added these data for Mississippi and Missouri. We also noted that the 3 low harvest years for mallards, they all kind of came on notoriously mild weather years, and they all happened in Mississippi, they happened in Missouri, they happened in Arkansas. The 3 low harvest years for mallards on a per hunter day basis happened in all those places. The season 2018-2019, 2020 and 2021 season, 2023-2024 season. So those 3 seasons, 18-19, 2021, 23-24, all notoriously mild weather years. But what is also noticeable is that Missouri mallard harvest per hunter day is pretty steady across time. The same for Mississippi, the same data for Mississippi has steadily declined though, and Arkansas, as noted, has fluctuated with the breeding population with some nuances, and maybe sex ratios in the breeding population have something to do with those, those data. But it doesn't change the fundamental knowledge that harvest doesn't drive duck populations anyway. Now look, do I intentionally shoot hens? No. But if I do once in a while, I'm not going to really feel super guilty about it, right? But we should be obviously always, if we can, trying to pick out drakes. I feel still in my gut for some reason, no matter that all the science shows that hen harvest doesn't really matter, that if we don't have to, don't shoot them, right? But I'm not going to feel guilty about it either. Again, not going out trying to shoot hens, trying to avoid in most cases, even with like widgeon, gadwall, pintails, other stuff. I think most of us try to do that though, right? Another thing though that we noticed in this analysis was that mallard harvest per hunter day was greater or much greater for Arkansas than Mississippi and Missouri. But recently, it is about on par with Missouri. So Arkansas is still shooting mallards. Point 1.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Point 2, ducks do migrate based on weather, okay? That information is abundantly clear, and we think that most duck hunters are wise enough to realize that this is the most common topic in the duck blind, and why we have continually moved duck seasons later so the ducks are here or wherever you're at when we can shoot them. our own research showed that changes in weather severity could enable 1.6 million mallard-sized ducks, so that'd be like black ducks, pintails, mallards, to remain farther north than normal over the past few decades. And then a paper from the University of Missouri showed that the average recovery latitude of mallard bands has shifted north 144 to 234 kilometers in December and 186 to 301 kilometers in January. So using those measures of area available that would have been previously frozen, so ducks are that much further north, we came up with something like 7 million mallard-sized ducks could stay in that area that Missouri, University of Missouri came up with. So for a 2-month period. So that stuff, that even though it seems like a subtle shift north, seems to have, it's an area north of where ducks used to stay, where mallards used to stay, that a whole pile of them can stay given what we know about food resources. So why do ducks still come to the south? The drive in their brains likely still plays a role, just like why mallards continue to show up in the deep south in November when they don't have to, right? But many don't do that nowadays, and when seasons end and they are still north, they survive. When the season ends in Missouri and it ends in Illinois, when it ends in New York, and they're still there because the weather hasn't pushed them, they survive. And the genetics of those birds and the programming in their brains is passed on. Look, ducks are successful because they have high generational rates. That is, they are mature in 1 year and are successful when conditions are right. So behaviorally, they change quickly, probably because genetically they can change relatively quickly. All right, so ducks migrate, and it's variable. Number 3. Our biggest challenge is ensuring that when conditions are right, that ducks can reproduce, like we know ducks can reproduce, and bring back the flights you remember. Of course, we would need to reduce harvest at some level of habitat destruction, but we are far from that point, and should not focus on harvest while letting the prairies disappear. We should not let the Canadian parklands and boreal forest be cut up without thought. Ducks are a binding force among us all. Look, the lives of ducks and the experiences in your duck blind are the same. If we conserve the world far away from us, we all win. We don't control the weather. Ducks die a lot, but damn it, we do control the landscape that ducks depend on. So let us make that the focus, period. In following, drain tile is a problem, and the science behind that will continue to accumulate despite that it may not happen quickly. Delta and Ducks Unlimited play the fine line of talking about troubles on the prairie and saving duck numbers because they must. Because no matter what, they can't grossly cross the ag sector that they have to work so closely with for the ducks and duck hunters. The reality, you're hearing it from the FowlWeather Podcast, is that agricultural production has always been the greatest threat to ducks because ag and ducks both seek high productivity soils to exist. Of course, there's nuances with this, like cattle grazing can be fine for ducks and so on and so forth. So it's not an absolute comment, but the tilling under of the grasslands and the draining of ponds seems to be based largely on agricultural production. So with drain tile, ponds are increasingly semi-permanent and permanent because we are draining smaller wetlands into larger wetlands. This is also likely why some species have done a bit better, like gadwall, that use those more permanent systems, whereas mallards really boom and bust because shallow wetlands are what they focus on. And so when things dry up and the shallow ones go away, mallard populations decline. When it gets wet and the shallow ones show back up, mallard populations increase. So yeah, drain tile is a problem, but in the Adaptive Harvest Management Model, AHM, for mallards, even if we had 1 million less ponds, we'd still be in a liberal season because the mallard population has not dropped enough yet. Next, a little bit more on AHM and how weak density dependence plays into that model. Number 5, listen real close. Nobody changed adaptive harvest management to keep liberal waterfowl seasons. The AHM matrix changes every year because new information is input into the model, and the strength of understanding and weight for density dependence and compensatory mortality change. So the matrix changes every year. It is inherent in that process. All right, a little sidebar here and a little more on the polar vortex before we jump into kind of the breakdown of mallard populations and harvest management through time. Okay, so the polar vortex breakup, like a bad relationship that ends every spring and then re-engages each fall and winter. The polar vortex is possibly about to go away for the coming spring. That's the forecast here, right? The polar vortex is cold air that spins at the North Pole during the dark days of winter. But once the daylight starts to hit and the atmosphere warms, the polar vortex just can't keep it together. It breaks up between mid-March and mid-April each year, and in the coming week, we're going to see one of the earliest breakups since 2016, we think. And if that happens, it can't reorganize, and then we will see regular spring weather and warming more quickly than normal, which might be good for some critters around the globe, maybe even ducks, but definitely things like, turkeys and grouse that like those dry springs. So that said, during this kind of what we're going to have is a sudden stratospheric warming, or SSW, that breaks apart the polar vortex. When that happens, parts of the cold of the polar vortex will spin off and push cold air into North America in the coming weeks. So expect some good cold shots into the mid-continent and even some continued snow into, late this week in the southern prairies and upper Midwest and over to the kind of eastern Great Lakes or lower Great Lakes region as well. What's going on with the Canadian prairies and U.S. prairies moisture-wise? The Canadian prairies and especially parklands are looking better than they have been, with the U.S. prairies definitely in a dry state that it's likely not going to be recovered by snowfall this year. So we can only hope now for timely rains at this point for the U.S. prairies. So we aren't in a dire situation, of years past, but certainly, in a better state overall moisture-wise in Canada this year than in past years. Of course, this is somewhat regional, so we're talking about the general pattern across the provinces in the Canadian prairies. Up next, a breakdown of mallard populations, harvest management, and so on through time. So please stick with us. Hold on, folks. Don't turn that channel. We've got some really exciting news for you. The FowlWeather Podcast has teamed up with Wildlife Strategies. That's right. I'm now working directly with Ryan Delaney of Wildlife Strategies to build value into your land. Wildlife Strategies is already known for quality wildlife habitat management, be it deer, turkeys, ducks, or whatever you pursue. Ryan knows his stuff. Look, I don't add my name to just any business, but I believe in what Wildlife Strategies is doing for landowners throughout the Southeast U.S. and beyond. If you want science-based solutions to create great wildlife habitat, Wildlife Strategies is your best bet. If you're interested in ducks, when we say, may your skies be filled, well, Wildlife Strategies does just that. They fill your skies with ducks. Contact Ryan Delaney today at ryan@farmlg.com for a site visit. You won't be disappointed you did. Ryan covers the southern tier of states, and I'm available to build habitat management plans across the northern tier. Contact us today for a quote. The Wildlife Strategies team sees your property through from the initial assessment and development of a 3-year time frame management plan through annual check-ins and course corrections as needed. Contact Ryan today at ryan@farmlg.com or Dr. Mike at FowlWeather.co. You won't be disappointed you did. Fill your skies with ducks and your forests and fields with deer and turkey with Wildlife Strategies. Remember, if you are interested in wetland or other wildlife habitat consulting, to contact me at drmike@FowlWeather.co. We specialize in wetland management strategies to attract more ducks, and also we do food plots and green space renewal. So give us a holler and see if our services are for you. Okay, let's jump into a bit of the history of mallard populations in North America and how they are managed. First, we manage mallards as three primary populations. The mid-continent population is mostly what we talk about because it is the largest population, fluctuating greatly based on prairie wetland conditions, as we've been talking about, from highs of around 10 to 11 million to lows of just below 5 million. So big fluctuations, 50% declines very often happening. The mid-continent population is surveyed in the traditional area of the Breeding Population and Habitat Survey of the U.S. and Canadian prairies. The Canadian parklands are kind of that transition zone from prairies to boreal. The western boreal forest, and then we add in the individual state counts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. We also survey the western and eastern mallard populations, which are quite a bit smaller. Western mallards consist of two substocks and are defined as those birds breeding in Alaska and those birds breeding in the southern Pacific Flyway, or that would be California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, where those counts are conducted. Estimates of these subpopulations have varied from 0.28 to 0.48 million in Alaska since 1990 and 0.43 to 0.64 million in the southern Pacific Flyway since 2010. The eastern mallard population has fluctuated from nearly 1.5 million to just over 1 million, with a generally declining trend since 1998 after years of increase, I'd say colonization of mallards in the east. More on that in part 4, where we kind of talk about like the future of mallards, right? Whereas other surveys are largely done by plane, much of the survey of the U.S. states of mallards and other waterfowl is done by ground surveys of 1 kilometer square plots during the breeding period. Also, interestingly, and often news folks don't know about in the east, is that mallards were not always common in the Atlantic Flyway. Black ducks were once the dominant duck, with mallards only an occasional breeder and migrating during winter from kind of the western Great Lakes region to the South Atlantic coast. But not until forests were cleared, black ducks declined, and we also released millions of game farm mallards of European descent, did mallards colonize the Atlantic Flyway. We're going to dig deeper into the history of mallards in the Atlantic Flyway in our final mallard episode in 2 weeks. In this episode, we're going to go into more detail about game farm mallards and what it may mean for the wild mallard population stock and outlook throughout North America. A quick side note here, and shout out to folks like Ray Alasauskas using Lincoln estimates, right, that uses banding data to estimate populations rather than direct counts or surveys. What we find is that each of these populations we just talked about, the mid-continent, the western, and the eastern population, is likely much greater than what we count because mallards also exist in places we don't count. And our counts are not perfect, right? Mostly they miss many, many ducks each year. They also, when they do an aerial survey, only count at one instance when we know in fact that mallards and other ducks settle on breeding grounds at different times of the breeding season. Good news is that generally Lincoln estimates do track with the breeding population surveys noted above, but it does demonstrate that the BPOP surveys are likely good at tracking large changes in population trends of mallards that are likely useful in harvest management decisions, but the BPOP very likely grossly underestimates the total population of mallards. What this also shows us is that we really, really need to continue our banding programs because Lincoln estimates are a relatively cheap analytical way to complement our other surveys. And maybe in the future, if defunding of the Mike Bird office and other places happens, maybe at least we can keep sending out really good students to band a lot of ducks, young kids that want to handle, catch, and band ducks, and then our folks at universities and in Fish and Wildlife Service can conduct the Lincoln estimates to get us some usable estimate of the population through time. Just a thought. But I always think that sometimes the money that we put out there would be really well spent on having a lot of young professionals out capturing and banding birds to collect the very important data that we can use in so many ways. For the western population, operational surveys started at slightly different times, but California and Oregon started in the 1990s, and those populations have since declined, due in most part, just like lots of things, to habitat loss in those regions. Other areas like British Columbia and Washington surveys became operational in the 2000s and show more stable populations, but not a lot of time to see those fluctuations like we do go way back to 1950s and 70s, like the traditional survey area, right? The Alaska population can contribute greatly to the Pacific flyway mallards on years when environmental conditions are conducive to productivity in the fall flight. But remember that the Pacific flyway also derives mallards from portions of the mid-continent population, right? As does the Atlantic flyway. So most of the Mississippi flyway itself is a funnel of mallards from west and east, and the mid-continent population also exports a lot of mallards west and east, and then they do obviously also go directly down the Central and Mississippi flyways. Trends through time for the mid-continent mallard population are already noted above, and we've talked about it a lot. There's substantial ups and downs that are strongly linked to wetland conditions on the prairies. And do remember that this is when kind of the AHM matrix why the AHM matrix has mallard BPOP and May pond counts, right? Because those two things have a strong relationship and lead us to understand the health of the mallard population. In a minute, we're going to get a bit into the history of kind of mallard harvest management, but first, let's detail the changes in mallard populations in the mid-continent through time. Remember, this population has only been at what we would call abnormally high levels, say 3 to 4 times, since 1955, right? The 50s, early 70s, late 90s, in mid-2010s were peaks. The longest streak of low mallard populations was the late 1970s until the mid-90s. This period was an unprecedented period of dry conditions and low May pond counts on the prairies. In 1986, a little bit in response to this, was the inception of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, and we also started to see some relief from the dry at just about the same time. And then, in the late 1990s, the prairies once again got really wet and mallards responded. We also, at that time, had a huge push for conservation practices on the prairie to help wetlands and grasslands, including the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. As time moves on, we actually have remaining relatively wet across years, despite the 2000s decline in mallards that dipped to a low population around 2005, and had at times accompanying low pond counts. Some of what we are seeing and continue to see today, again, is this wetland consolidation from drain tile, which is likely depressing mallard numbers because they don't use those large wetlands as much as they do the more easily drained small wetlands. After the depressed mallard population in the 2000s, we saw a rebound in numbers. A lot of folks are questioning that, whether the recent population actually jumped up to as much as 10 million mallards, right? It is likely that some or many factors resulted in an inflated mallard population during this recent period. But again, this does not change fundamentally how we approach mallard harvest management. There'll be more on that later when we talk about integrated population models. So with a little background on kind of mallard populations across the continent and their fluctuations, let's jump into harvest management, because we are back at a lower population, right? But if you look across the line in the matrix, the AHM matrix for mallards, right, at 6.5 million mallards, and just say go across that matrix and keep reducing the numbers of May ponds, you'll notice that we remain in a liberal framework of 60 days and 6 ducks. That is because information suggests that mallards are weakly density dependent, right? That is, density dependence exists. We're not saying it doesn't, and what that is productivity declines as you pack more mallards into smaller and smaller space. But at the current number of 6.5 million, as we reduce the number of ponds, it is not expected that we reduce productivity greatly under the current model. Now, let's say if we counted, 2 million mallards less, then we'd be getting close to the moderate rather than liberal 60-day and 6-duck package. But we are far from that, even if some have suggested we are overcounting mallards. Also understand that the entire model scales if we adjust our counts, for instance, if we somehow count too many male mallards as pairs. Also, among the points we are trying to get across is that the peak periods of mallards are much shorter lived and not the norm. The norm is more like 5 to 7 million mallards, right? Somewhere about what we have now. 10 million is not the norm, and we've maybe hit that possibly 4 times, maybe only 3 times if this recent peak in numbers isn't as great as we thought. But we've only hit this 3 to 4 times since 1955. So lots of folks get spoiled with, peaks in mallards and then think, it's going to be the norm and they're just going to see tons of mallards every single year when it's not the norm. Okay, so let's end with a little bit on the history of harvest management without really going into the weeds too much. It basically has 3 phases. The smoke-filled room, where biologists from each state got together at flyway meetings. They looked at the BPOP survey results, talked about how their duck season was the year before, and decided on the regulatory package that would exist. Of course, there were deviations from this, like the point system and other nuances, but this has basically existed in this form for many years. Structured decision-making, like AHM, did not exist yet, and politics could play a big role in the decisions. Absent solid science to drive the decision process, it was how people felt, and again, politics played a larger role. But then we increasingly moved towards applying AHM in 1995, which used mathematical models of population dynamics to both help us learn about the drivers of duck populations and also provided an objective decision about the season that we would be provided. The reason for AHM was to fend off political moves that didn't follow what was best for the ducks, and to fend off legal attacks on duck season by, say, the defenders of wildlife. Okay, so that all didn't quite work when Trent Lott moved the duck season closing date from January 17th to January 31st for Mississippi, of which ultimately Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee started out with, and in 1999. But remember that this didn't really affect the season length or bag, although originally the season was cut to 51 days in accepting states. By 2002, all Mississippi flyway states had the option of extending the season to the last Saturday in January. Anyhow, a lot of folks to this day are not in agreement with the season running past the middle of January, showing that keeping politics out of the realm of waterfowl season harvest decision-making is likely in our best interest. Okay, so 1, smoke-filled room and its subjective decisions with political influence and potential to get sued by antis over duck seasons. 2, AHM, which provided science-based objective decision-making, which has never been challenged legally by anti-hunting groups because it is based on sustainable harvest with solid science behind the decisions. And now, I'd say we're on to number 3, which is still AHM, but now includes Bayesian integrated population modeling, which is an improved method that incorporates past information or experiences to inform the current process. That is, the population this year is likely to be close to last year's population because it can't grow or decline beyond the bounds of what is biologically possible, so this type of information is incorporated into the models, and IPMs further provide a powerful tool that's used by waterfowl ecologists that combine data streams like counts, survival, and reproductive success into a unified analysis that improves the precision of parameter estimates and our understanding of population dynamics. Okay, wow. That all sounds fancy, but it's a way to use data streams so that they can check each other, so that if one data stream is incorrect, it doesn't follow what's going on with the other ones, it can be corrected by the others. Or even if a variable is missing, it can be calculated by other available data. So this is another reason that even if the BPOP for mallards is lower than what we are actually counting or estimating, that fundamentally this will not change the matrix decision to any great degree. Until we have different model weights and somehow new information that shows that harvest is additive or can certainly depress the mallard population, we are unlikely to see major changes to season structures. Now, this may lead one to think that AHM, adaptive harvest management, is not actually adaptive. And we've said this before on here. It is adaptive, but given our current knowledge of the system, we've just never hit the trigger point to need to have more restrictive seasons if the overall goal is to maximize harvest over an infinite time frame, with the understanding that most of the fluctuations of mallard populations is based on habitat conditions on the prairies. Whew, okay, we covered a lot of ground today, folks, but a quick summary could be that the status quo for mallards is not problematic, that all the issues being brought up have been made up by folks looking to write a new narrative. The system is not effed, my friends across duck country. Mallard populations vary greatly across this great continent and are likely much greater than estimated by the BPAP. The Lincoln estimates tell us that. But certainly the variation in mallards is primarily driven by wetlands and grassland conditions on the prairies and elsewhere where mallards exist. Harvest management decisions have been moved from indefensible, subjective decisions with lots of politics at play to objective decisions driven by sound science and now integrating the best of the best information we have into integrated population models that are increasingly resilient to data stream deviations or, hey, let's even call them errors for that matter. Despite the duck season lengths and bag limits changed in the past, we have learned a lot about ducks and mallards specifically. Mostly that hunting is not much of a driver of the population, and all the tinkering we did in the past did little, if anything, to quote-unquote save the ducks. So nowadays, despite that people cry that AHM is not being adaptive, it does not need to be, because the real efforts, both among our great government and our private sector biologists, needs to be focused on saving the prairies and our wetlands and grasslands. Instant ducks, just add water. I guess, and a whole bunch of grass, too. Here's the deal, my friends. Mallards are not really completely in trouble. They're always going to vary. The question now is when water comes back to the prairies, has marginal farming practices, including drain tile, poor water quality, and general lack of wherewithal by the powers that be to save all the habitat, right? Is that going to result in a mallard population that doesn't increase when we see the water come back? That's what folks are looking for right now. As the water comes back to the prairies, which it will, which it always has, is can the mallard population recover given the assault that there has been on the prairies? So let's stick together as the great people of Duck Country USA and stand up for the ducks. You want more ducks in front of your blind? Get involved. Save wetlands. Find a way to keep grass on the prairies. And do it today, damn it. You should have done it yesterday, but definitely do it today. All right, the mighty greenhead will be back with us in 2 weeks for our final episode where we detail the future of the mallard in North America. What can you do to help keep the wild North American mallard with us? Thanks for listening. And as always, may your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friends.